Kelly started 4 years ago as though we stole her away from Gardner, excuse me, not Gardner, from Cooke City, and as our museum curator, and she was working on all kinds of exhibits as far away from the gallows as she possibly could be, I think. And when it came time for her to start on all of the curation and the research behind this project, one day she came up to me and she said, Cindy, there was so much information that I could write a book. He said, I think you should. And so this is going to be a great piece that we'll be able to have as part of our storytelling over at the museum. And I couldn't be more proud of her work and her commitment to really deep diving, and believe me, she dove deep on all of this. And without further ado, I'd like to introduce Kelly Suzanne Hartman for the presentation tonight.
Somehow news that the hanging was to occur sometime after midnight on July 18th reached the local community. The sidewalks in front of the jail following the dinner hour through the night were walked by those hoping to catch a glimpse of the proceedings inside. However, no one was allowed admission to the building besides those who had personally been invited. Priests Latham and Blair had the closest interactions with Seth during that night. The priest had arrived at 1:30 a.m., immediately attending to Seth in his cell at the back of the building. Less than an hour before his death, Seth was baptized and made a private confession to the Catholic faith. Whatever was said to the priest is unknown. At 2:00 a.m., Under Sheriff Orville Jones read the final death warrant to Seth in his cell. Seth listened quietly. 4 minutes later, what would then be known in the papers as the Death March began. The procession was led by 2 priests, followed by Seth, then Sheriff James Smith. According to the Bozeman Courier, as he emerged from his cell, Danner was seen to smooth back his long, straight black hair with both hands, and throwing his head back and extending his chest, walked with unfaltering steps through the long corridor into the death chamber. The death chamber was located in the jailer's office, a very small room that sat between the sheriff's office and the bullpen. The stairway consisted of 19 steps, with 2 landings that allowed the trajectory of the stairs to turn from the east to the west. To make his way to the platform, Seth would travel under the gallows, then perpendicularly away from it, then parallel but still pulling away before the last 2 turns, one that would draw him back perpendicularly toward the platform, and finally, the last that would pull him in a direct line towards the mechanism. It would not be until that final turn that the rope would be easily in his line of sight. In many ways, this meandering path to his death echoes his meandering path through life. Throughout his year of incarceration, Seth lived in resignation to his situation, and yet simultaneously in disbelief of his mortality. The walk away and toward the gallows mirrors his possible frame of mind. Once the group arrived at the top, Sheriff Smith attended to the adjusting of straps that were placed around Seth's ankles, knees, waist, arms, and wrists. Apparently, Seth watched Smith with interest as this job was done, and it was said that not once during the entire procedure did Danner's eyes flinch or his demeanor show any signs of weakness or indecision. The priest read a Latin ritual, during which Seth had held a small crucifix, which he kissed before returning to Father Latham. Sheriff Smith asked the man he called Dan, "Have you got anything to say?" To which Seth responded with his last words on earth, "I want to tell you people that I hold no malice against any man. I have made peace with my God, and will go to him knowing that I am fully prepared. And I would like to see each and every one of you people to follow my example. I have nothing more to say. Goodbye, one and all." The black hood was then adjusted, during which it was said that many of the spectators turned their heads away. According to the Courier, after a moment of silence, the trap was sprung, and Danner had fallen more than 6 feet into eternity. So while I can't say that Seth Danner is innocent, I can't say that he is guilty either. The first time I saw the gallows, I was about 5 years old, and my parents had a car break down in Bozeman, and we were getting it fixed, and so they took us to see this museum, and it was very hot out. I was a 5-year-old with a harmonica, so I think I was pretty annoying walking around the sidewalks. And we stopped at this museum, and all I remember, honestly, is the brick of the building, and that's really all I remember. My dad remembered walking into that room and seeing the platform, and there really wasn't much of a story that went with it at that time. And so all he remembered was, gosh, why do they have this in the building? This is, like, he didn't really want his kids to see it and everything. And so that's kind of hung with him throughout this whole time. So flash forward 25 years later, and I'm now the curator at that same museum. And I now had to face walking under this every day at work. And so to cope with that, I decided to face the darkness. And for me, I found a light of illumination. So we may never know the true story. Maybe the light will shine more in one direction for you than for others. In any case, there is a question, and that is reason enough to tell a story. So, on behalf of Seth Danner, Seth was born in 1882 in Kansas. His uncle died in 1901, and that year Seth married his uncle's widow, Nancy. Nancy was just a bit older than Seth. So in that marriage, he became stepfather to Iva Danner. Together, Nancy and Seth would have 3 kids. One of them was named Florence Danner. In 1915, Nancy died. Later that year, Iva, who had went to spend time with her uncle, wrote Seth and asked him for help. He immediately went up, picked her up, and they left Kansas under cover of night, together with Seth's daughter, Florence. So it was 3 of them that left. And this photograph, oh, that was in the last one. Okay. That is actually a photograph of Marvin Danner, and I just wanted to put that in there to represent the kids. So in December of 1916, Seth married Iva. They were married in Dillon, so just a reminder because it's pretty complicated. Iva is actually Seth's cousin and his stepdaughter. But he married her. She was actually forced to marry her in Dillon as she was about 8 months pregnant. Or I guess by that time she was 9 because the baby was born the next day. But he was actually thrown in jail before that and told, you have to marry this girl. So the first child born was Della Danner, and to my mind, she may not be Seth's. I believe that there's quite a possibility that Seth went to rescue Iva from a situation where she had become pregnant in Kansas. And so I think he just kind of did what he had to do. So we're not sure about Della. And then later, 2 other children were born, Marvin and Donald. Together, they all traveled about Montana and South Dakota. They kind of went back and forth quite a bit. Montana in the 1920s was pretty much in the Great Depression. The Great Depression hit Montana quite a bit earlier. So you're seeing a lot of people who are traveling between harvest season here and other work elsewhere. For the Danners, they would work the harvest, and Seth would work as a mechanic on the off-season. Fall of 1920, they decided to head west, and this time they decided to travel with a couple named the Sprouses. The Sprouses and them all traveled in 2 separate Ford trucks. So the Danners had Seth's first daughter, Florence, from his first marriage with Nancy, and Della and Marvin with them at this time. Donald had not been born yet. And they had they were traveling out to Montana. The Sprouses were going to continue on to Oregon, where Florence Sprouse, so there's 2 Florences, one's a daughter, one's the wife, and they were traveling out to her home area. Together, they decided to camp at Central Park, Montana. We're not really sure why they decided that that was the place to stay for longer than a night, as that's pretty much how they traveled before then. But they pulled off what was then the Yellowstone Trail into a place that had been kind of a campground and set up camp, and that was in October of 1920. They would remain there until November, mostly trapping the area and selling furs in Bozeman and locally. And in November 17th, 1920, the Danners arrived in Three Forks, Montana, which they would call their home for the next couple of years. And the Sprouses simply disappeared. So flash forward to 1923. In April, Seth is arrested for moonshine. While they're searching his house, they find his family in a destitute state. They also find a bunch of stolen items. This landed him 5 to 10 at the Deer Lodge State Prison. However, he was paroled by Judge Law because I feel like Law saw something in him that he thought was good to foster, and he thought that Danner could do better. So he told him to get a job in Bozeman. They set him up at a garage here as a mechanic. He was a very good mechanic. And his wife and children stayed in Three Forks, but he was told he needs to provide for them or he's heading to the state prison if he doesn't. So during this time, Iva and Seth are separated. She stays with the kids and he's in Bozeman. During that time, Three Forks to Bozeman, if you can imagine how fast cars went then, you're looking at about an hour at least to make that journey. In June of 1923, so a few months after, Iva decides to tell all. And the headline is read, "Conscience-stricken wife tells of husband's brutal murders. Seth is jailed again. This time, the night before the bodies are recovered." And interestingly, when they went to pick him up, it actually was at night. They didn't arrive to Bozeman with him until about midnight. And Seth drove the motorcycle, and the deputy rode in a sidecar. The motorcycle stalled a couple times on the way here, and the deputy had to be scared to death of what was going to happen. He did have a gun. He was ready. And Seth would just start it back up and continue on. And we all know Seth had to know what he was coming in for. So before Iva could testify against her husband, she needed a divorce. August of 1923, there was a divorce trial, mostly neglect and cruelty. The neglect was pretty obvious. A lot of people had noticed that this family needed supplies, needed food, clothing. A lot of people in the community had helped out. But the cruelty was kind of more Iva's word against his, and we're not sure how deeply that ran. I did find it doesn't seem like he was cruel to his children. It seems like he really did love his children. The divorce was granted. So in October 22nd to the 25th was the murder trial. Two stories were revealed at this trial. Iva's had already been told a couple times in full in the newspaper prior to the trial, so pretty much everyone knew what hers was. Seth's wouldn't come out until the actual trial. For Iva, the motive of Seth killing both John and Florence Sprouse was robbery. However, it seems that the Sprouses only had $1.85 in money. They owed Seth money, and the only thing that they really had was a Ford truck, which Seth did end up selling, but not a whole lot of money there. That would have been extra. So in Iva's story, Seth and John had gone out into the woods to check their trap lines. Seth had come back, and Florence had started to become frantic as night fell as to where her husband was. Seth said, "Well, I left him back, along the river, and I don't know what happened to him." And according to Iva, at some point, Florence got a little too insistent, and he hit her over the back of the head with an axe, and then strangled her. So in Iva's story, clearly she would have been traumatized. Seth put both bodies into a tent and ended up burying them a night later. However, in Seth's story, the motive is infidelity and jealousy. According to Seth, Florence had found both John and Iva in the brush and had become extremely jealous of the whole situation. John and Seth had talked it through and had decided that they were just going to part ways here, and that Seth was actually going to give John some money so that he could go on his way. However, things had gotten out of hand, and Florence had gone out to check the trap lines with her husband, John, and had killed John. and then come back and in a jealous rage tried to kill Iva as well. Only the gun hadn't worked. It was a gun that apparently Seth had thrown at some point during some kind of argument with his wife before. The trigger wouldn't work. And so he was able to wrestle it out of Florence's hands, and during that time, Iva hit Florence over the head with an axe, so self-defense, and later Florence had died. So these are the two stories that we are faced with. Iva's never changed, not once. She just had these facts lined up. Seths really felt like something that he was trying to remember all the details, and in particular, there was one where he said that the gun mechanism had caught on Florence's hand and practically pulled off her finger. That's something, who makes that up? That's an interesting detail, and Iva didn't have those details. But either way, those are the two that were revealed at the trial. The prosecuting attorney was Peterson, and he was kind of taken over by Rankin. And Rankin was called in because this was a pretty high-profile case for Montana. They had many witnesses to prove cruelty and bad character, but really no witnesses that could say what happened because it was Iva against Seth. There wasn't a whole lot more to that. Defense attorney Smith, however, only used Seth's statement. They were hoping that their young daughter Florence was going to be able to testify as to what had happened. Seth had said that she had seen everything that had occurred with Iva and Florence and could save him. However, she was unable to testify. When they got her on the stand, she entirely broke down, and they didn't get a word out of her. So, at the trial, I think to much of the community's disappointment, Seth did not take the stand, and they just used a couple of statements that he had made at the courthouse. Basically, the story that I told you of how things had happened. So in the end, it's really Iva against Seth. In the end, 4 votes were taken, and they were always unanimous in guilt. However, it was debated about the sentencing. In some of the first ones, they all found him guilty, but they weren't sure about the sentence of hanging for sure. And they were concerned about Sheriff Smith having to carry this out. So they brought in the sheriff and asked him, and he said he had no problems with carrying this out. And that's really what brought them to be unanimous in it. So Seth was found guilty and sentenced to execution by hanging. They tried to make an appeal to kind of bring in some witnesses who had said that some of the jury had been basically biased before, because as I said, Iva's story had been in the paper before anybody had known about they were going to be on the jury. So people did have some opinions about them. The Danners weren't very well known or anything like that, so you could form a lot of opinions about them. So in particular, there was one juror who said that he would hang Seth no matter what. And so they were, of course, they were able to say, well, he didn't say that or whatever. But it is interesting to find out that 17 years later, that same juror ended up in the Deer Lodge State Prison for murder. So I think maybe something was right there. The appeal was denied, and the execution date was set for January 11th, 1924. The main reason they denied it is Judge Law believed that everybody could read a paper and determine for themselves that it wasn't all true. In light of our society today, that's very interesting, I think. Before Seth's execution date, about a month after the trial, Iva remarried. And I have to read to you her wedding announcement. It said, so this is in the papers, while her divorced husband, cousin, and stepfather, Seth Danner, an itinerant automobile mechanic of part Cherokee Indian blood, lies in the Gallatin County Jail in Bozeman under sentence of death, awaiting the date of his execution, which was pronounced upon him last month by a jury in the district court for one of the most cruel and cold-blooded murders recorded in the criminal annals of Montana, the killing of Mrs. Florence Sprouse and her husband, John Sprouse, traveling and hunting companions of the Danners on November 14, 1920 at Central Park, Mrs. Ida Bertha Danner, largely upon whose testimony her former husband was convicted, was married Monday in Butte to Jim Trobia, aged 36 years, of Three Forks, the man so frequently referred to throughout the Danner trial as Jim the Baker. I think this must be put down as one of the strangest wedding announcements ever. When that happened, Seth thought he had to be free because clearly she had an affair before. Jim the Baker had come up quite a bit during the trial, so he thought that might save him. A day before his execution date, there was a stay of execution as a 110,000-word transcript of the trial and an appeal had been sent to the Supreme Court of Montana. So between the stay of execution and the results of the appeal, there were many letters written on behalf of Seth. Many of them came from people interested in preventing somebody from execution, people against the death penalty. Some were of a religious strain. Some of his writings had been published in the local paper and they did have a religious bent to them. And some were from Seth's own sisters, one of them in particular, Mabel Moody. Mabel's letter of July 1st mentions a visit she had made to Seth in probably the most emotive words to be spoken about Seth. She states, "When I went to jail to see my brother, I had to walk under the gallows. In my mind, I can see him day or night, hanging at the end of that rope. Gladly, I would take his place if I could. Then I would not be left behind to worry and think endless nights and days if my brother has to go. I am praying to God to take me with him. We were pals in life. I want to be his pal in death. Please, Governor Dixon, write and tell me that you will save my brother and God will bless you." Seems the gallows had also haunted her. So the appeal to the Supreme Court was denied. Judge Law's ruling of it had been upheld, and a new execution date was set for July 18, 1924. Preparations were made, including putting a new ring into what holds the rope, because Seth was quite a large guy. He was over 6 foot and pretty sturdily built, and so they wanted to make sure that everything was going to go off as the way that it should. They also tested it with a piece of concrete culvert as well. And it's interesting to me that they didn't make these preparations for the first execution date. They must have known that there really was going to be an appeal process in there. Others later stated that it was one of the most humane as well as the most efficiently conducted hangings they had ever witnessed. Following Seth's speech, the Chronicle noted that all had sighed relief, glad that the man had not broken down in that moment. It made it easier for the men who were willing to see a human life snuffed out. The body was placed in a black coffin, which was adorned by a silver plate inscribed with "At Rest" and a silver crucifix. At 3:00 a.m., the body was buried in an unmarked grave at the Brondell's Catholic Cemetery. The flashlight burial was attended to by Father Latham and assisted by Father Blair, and at least one altar boy, and was read in both Latin and English. According to the paper, it had been a calm and clear night, allowing the moon to cast its light upon the scene. By some reports, nearly 20 people had been there, but we're not sure. The Courier painted a vivid picture of Sheriff Smith in this place, relating that he had been the last of the officials to leave. As he reached the moonlit road, the soft, hollow thud of the hard, dry earth striking the casket as it lay deep in the grave could be plainly heard in the uncanny stillness of the early morning hour, like an echo in the distance. The other cars had gone ahead and were lost to sight. He drove home alone and in company only of his thoughts. Seth once said that it isn't a hard thing to die the way they have it fixed. It will only be a fraction of a second before I'm in another and better land. The family, the kids, were strewn about in orphanages. Ida didn't want them. Donald, the youngest, lived a life of crime. And I've spoken to some of his family, and it definitely is still, there is a very bitter kind of feeling towards what had happened to their grandfather had in turn hurt Donald. Marvin, on the other hand, who is pictured here, turned his life into good, and his family is here today. Joe, Marvin's grandson, told me that his life has been better because the actions of his great-grandfather Seth put his grandfather Marvin in a difficult position. Marvin rose above. But maybe the most profound piece comes from Seth himself. The day before he died, Seth stated, "Why should you or any of the world pity me? I am infinitely better off than any of you, for I know when I am to die and am fully prepared. You do not know when your end will come. I feel sorry for them, for they have been good to me while I have been here, and I know they are feeling pretty bad about it. I try to make it as easy as I can for them by telling them, and in other ways show them, that I am not worrying, but they look at me and think I am handing out a big bluff. They think I'll weaken when the time comes to step up to the works to get my neck stretched, but I won't, and they won't have to feed me anything to keep my nerve up either. I am 42 years old and have never had anything in my life worth living for. I have had to work hard ever since I was big enough, and I have never experienced much pleasure. During the 15 months I have been in jail, here I have had a chance to consider the facts and look over my past life. From what I know of life, there is nothing very interesting or promising to look forward to. The world is in a state of turmoil. Read the papers any day, and you will realize there is no peace anywhere on earth. Everything is upside down, and why should I desire to continue in it with the experience I have had and with no chance to better an earthly existence?" Seth once said he wished they would send him over to the big house to work on a farm running tractors. "I sure like to listen to the music of those tractors," he said. Maybe that's where he is now. But for me, that room, once known as the death chamber, has become a place of peace. Thank you. So I'd be happy to take any questions, and I would love it if any of you wanted to come up and say a few words as well.
You're good at it.
Well, I'm Joe Stevens from Bellingham, Washington, great-grandson of Seth. My mom Janet is here, and my wife Robin. And a couple people in the room have known me for a few years and probably now understand why I am the way I am. I want to thank Kelly especially and her staff, her helpers. I've learned more about my family history in the last 2 days than I've known in my entire life. Literally. I've always said my family tree is a stick. I knew my grandparents on both sides of the family, but I knew my grandfather Marvin and my grandmother Minnie, and that's as far as the family history goes, as far as it's ever gone. We'd heard that my great-grandfather was hung in prison for something that he did or didn't do, and that was all I ever knew. Never knew where, never knew Montana, never knew anything. My younger brother got to looking around on the internet a year or two ago and stumbled upon a little bit, and then things kind of blossomed from there, and we stopped by the museum, and I think that's where Kelly got my information, I think, and reached out to me a year ago or something. And so from a year ago till now, we've learned everything that we know about our family history. And she asked me if I wanted to write something in the book or something, how it affected my life. And at the time I thought, well, I never knew anything, never knew the guy, I don't know how it could possibly affect my life. But as I got to thinking about it and realized that there really have been profound effects on my life that I wasn't even aware of. And something more than anything that I've learned since I was a little kid, learned from my grandfather, was you got to take responsibility for yourself. You have no control over the situation you're put in, but all the control over how you respond to it. And apparently one side of the family, my grandpa's brother, went one direction and my grandpa went the other direction. And I learned when I was a little kid that nobody's going to give you anything. You got to reach out and get it for yourself. You got to work, and you got to work hard every day. My grandpa, and apparently my great-grandpa, worked hard every day of their life until they died. And get up in the morning and go to work, and you take responsibility for yourself, and it is what it is. You just got to work hard every day. So I guess that's what it really taught me. You know, it'd be nice if we had family history to look back on, but we don't. So we just got to do the best we can with what we have. We're given a certain number of days. Nobody knows how many it is, so just got to get up every morning, go to work, and do the best you can. But I really appreciate, Kelly, the hard work that you put in and giving us a little bit of family history. And hopefully it's just a starting point to learn more. I've been through Bozeman 100 times, and it was just someplace I'd stop and use the rest area or get fuel on the way to Wyoming to go deer hunting or something. And it's kind of nice now to have somewhat of a connection and to the place where my ancestors lived. It's kind of cool. So anyway, I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yes.
Did you get a chance to read the court files themselves? Did you
Yes.
get to dig into the boxes and all that stuff?
Well, I got to look, we have a copy of the transcript at the museum, and so I did get to go through all of that, and that's really where the bulk of the information is, because newspaper articles they only have so much, and they were quite biased at that time, so yeah, the transcript was huge. It also helped me in finding where the murders had taken place, and things like that. We actually went over to the Law and Justice Center, because I thought maybe the evidence still exists, you know, because it was an execution, and they had gotten rid of all that in about the 80s, so missed it. But in that evidence would have been a lot of photographs, and that breaks my heart that we don't have those. And actually, Margie up here typed up all of the newspaper articles and the transcript for me. It was amazing. And that made it so much easier when I was going through and I wanted to remember where one thing was. I could keyword search it instead of like flipping through forever. So that was amazing. Huge help.
The statement that you just read, was that something that he hand wrote? And how did you come about that?
It was actually printed in the paper.
In the paper?
Yeah. Before each execution date, they just really were like there all the time asking him questions and wanted to know what it was like and everything. But that is the longest statement, other than when he talks about the murders for like an actual statement. But that's the longest thing that you really ever hear from him, his own words. They also published a couple of his letters to his sister, and those are quite interesting as well. But yeah, there's not a lot that you actually get to hear from him.
And then that portrait picture, how did that come about? Was that, that's quite a picture.
Yeah, the front kind of one with the guitar, or the...
Well, he was sitting in a chair.
Yes, yeah. So actually I have a great story about that. Before that we had the profile, and there was one more that was printed in the newspaper, and we kind of took those two to be sort of a mugshot because there was a profile and that, so that's kind of what we thought. They're both great pictures. And then when I was talking to Joe, he was like, yeah, we have some pictures, and I'll see if my mom can get them to you. And I believe you were visiting somebody else, and there was like this time crunch because at the end of writing a book, they just like want everything right now. And then I heard that there could be more photos, and I was like, I'd love to get a photo of Marvin in here because that's important. And so he sent me photos, a whole bunch of them, and some of them were the ones you saw of Marvin, and a lot of them as a kid, and you're just like, oh, man, this kid's so cute, and I'm scrolling along, and all of a sudden, like, it starts to come up my screen as I'm scrolling, and I'm like, that's Seth. And I jumped out of my chair, because we only had seen 2 photographs of him, and I'm like running out of the room, and I'm like, somebody come look, this is Seth, and he's got his guitar. And once I saw that, I was just like, completely blown away. It's an amazing photograph, and it's beautiful. And he was a musician. He played a lot while he was at the jail. So I think that's so important, and I was so excited that you could share that with me, and we got it in the book. I wanted it on the cover, but they had their own ideas, so. But it made the back of the book, so, and it also made the newspaper the other day as well, but it's an incredible photograph.
So I'm also confused, when you first started, you said that he had long dark hair and he pulled it back, but in any pictures, he doesn't appear to be Native American or Indian.
Yeah, so I think in length, just like the length that he had would have been considered longer for that time period, because he could kind of like slick it back. He was very, it was important that he looked good. He got a lot of female visitors, and he wanted to look good. Before any of them came, he got a little angry if they sent somebody in and hadn't shaved and everything. But they did really play up the Native aspect quite a bit, and they didn't really talk about a lot, but I think just throwing it in there during that time period was kind of like a racial profiling thing, and I think a lot of people saw it and thought, oh, he's Native, like that's probably why he's crazy and killed people, and that's sad. I mean, we should not be thinking of it that way, and I have a feeling that underlying a lot that we don't see here was some of that people were picking up on that. As soon as it was mentioned, that's where their minds were going, which is too bad. I did try to contact the Cherokee Nation to see if I could figure that out, and so far I haven't come up with anything, but it's hard to tell. Mm-hmm.
What happened to Iva?
Good question. So after she married, well, first she got rid of the kids right away. Then she said, well, maybe she's going to go stay with her uncle and, find a job. And then suddenly she's married. And it all happened very quickly. Everybody was shocked, actually, by that. She ended up in Butte for a spell where she married Jim. They ended up being in Washington, Oregon area, and then eventually in California. At some point, she did have her daughter Della with her, and I think she must have come back and got her at some point. I'm not quite sure how that worked out. But she's listed in some of the census records with them. But then, and when Jim the baker, James Troglia, dies, she's not listed in his death certificate anywhere. She's not buried next to him in Butte. And in 1940, basically, I lose her in California. And I've talked to some other family members, and that's as far as we all get. So I did do the math, because I thought, she can't still be alive, right? Come back and get me. But she's not. She'd be like 120 or something like that. But yeah, I wish I could find out more. I have a feeling that she either left Jim the baker or they divorced. I didn't find any divorce papers, but maybe they just separated. And she probably took on another name, another last name at least. So just can't find her. Mm-hmm.
What about the daughter that saw everything but couldn't speak at the trial?
Mm-hmm.
Did she ever say anything later, and what happened to her?
It doesn't appear that she did. And I haven't been able to track down family members in that side. It's so hard to track women through history because of all the name changes and everything. But I'm hoping that somebody, maybe she did make like a deathbed confession or wrote it down somewhere, or that information could be out there. As far as I know, she didn't really ever say anything. Maybe she never saw anything either. Maybe she was so traumatized that she can't remember, or maybe she was told by Iva not to say a word. That's the one I kind of tend to believe for sure. But also there was a legend that Iva had confessed on her deathbed. But that legend appears to have happened before. I think she was still alive when people were saying that, so I'm not sure about that. But Florence did get married, lived in Washington, and actually lived with her uncles, so I'm not quite sure what happened to her after that, but it had to be a traumatizing experience if she did see something. Mm-hmm.
Can you mention about where Iva was at and where Seth was at physically over in?
Yeah, definitely. So when Seth was put in jail for a spell, he would have been in some of the pre-sentencing cells in the bullpen. He really liked to show off to the other inmates, so he'd like do pull-ups and all this kind of stuff. He was a strong guy, for sure. And eventually, when it came time for the murder trial, they did move him back to Siberia, which is kind of in the back of the museum. It's basically where you would put people who could harm themselves. So usually you're stripped down, put back there, nothing that you could hurt yourself with, and usually sent to warm springs after that. But they used it for Seth. I believe he had a couch back there, some kind of sofa. I think they really gave him anything he wanted back there, because he was probably the longest anybody had been living in a jail. He spent at least a year back in Siberia. So they did make him comfortable. And so at that time, actually before that, before the murder trial, they brought Iva in because they thought she was going to run, actually. And there was something about maybe having some kind of deal where they were going to pay her if she testified, or they were going to bring her in, and they decided to just bring her in. So she lived in the women's quarters, cells upstairs. They must not have had any other women prisoners, I'm guessing. So that's where she was. She could come and go as she pleased. She had a job. She was buying herself new clothes, things like that she really couldn't have before. And so she could actually hear Seth playing his, at that time they said he had a banjo, maybe it was a guitar, we're not sure. But she could hear him playing downstairs. And then they said that she listened pretty intently. I think there was some weird, maybe she still loved him, maybe not. It's a weird relationship overall, for sure. But yeah, so they were both in the building up until at the end of the murder trial, and then Iva left. All right. Well, thank you so much all for coming. Thank you for wearing masks. Really appreciate it. We are going to have a book signing over at the museum. I will be actually in the gallows room, the death chamber. So you're welcome to come in and buy a book, get a book signed, and yeah, chat and see if you have any other questions over there. But thank you so much for coming.